Here you have the horizontal stabilizer temporarily sitting on top of the fuselage. Now what you'll notice in this picture are the pencil lines, one that runs down the center line of the fuselage on the plywood that the horizontal rests on. There's individual lines on the horizontal itself representing its center, and then there's another pencil line running down the center line of the tail, what is that, the tail stock or the tail post. In this picture is just a little bit clearer photograph of the various pencil marks. You see the one in the foreground is the one representing center line of the fuselage. The one most prominent in the picture, that is the center line for the horizontal stabilizer, and then there's another line on the leading edge of the stabilizer marking center. Here's a little bit different angle. This line in the foreground again just is the center line mark for the horizontal stabilizer on the trailing edge, and that lines up with the vertical center line on the tail post. And then I've got another picture here, a little bit different angle again of the tail post and the corresponding center lines. So basically, if you mark center on your horizontal, find the center of your horizontal and mark pencil lines on the leading edge, the middle beam, and the trailing edge, and then line that up with your center lines on the fuselage, you will have a very, very good ballpark center of the horizontal to the fuselage. And then this last picture here is just a little reminder picture that you want a gap between the leading edge of the horizontal stabilizer and the turtle deck stringers. You want a gap between the two because obviously this all gets wrapped with fabric and paint and you don't want a tight fit, so leave yourself a little bit of a gap. And you can also see between the leading edge of the horizontal and the fuselage, I've got some plywood in there. Those are spacers to help maintain the horizontal parallel to the longerons of the fuselage. And I'll get into that a little bit more here in a second. Next up then, after you have your pencil lines drawn on your fuselage and your horizontal stabilizer, you want to square the horizontal to the fuselage from a fixed point on the fuselage. What I chose to do was to use the back of the pilot's seat. Now you could use any reference point that you want, but it was relatively convenient to use the back of the pilot's seat with the tape measure because it was a good place to hook it onto, as you see in this picture. So you take a measurement from this side, from the fuselage reference point to the trailing edge corner of the horizontal, and then you take the same measurement on the other side, hook it on the other side of the pilot seat, and then take a measurement back to that other corner of the horizontal stabilizer and move the horizontal around until those measurements are the same, but keeping it centered with your pencil marks. Now that you have the horizontal stabilizer centered on the fuselage left to right and using a fixed point on the fuselage measuring back to the the trailing edge tips of the horizontal stabilizer, you have it square. You can go ahead and clamp it in place, making sure that it doesn't move, making sure that you maintain that gap between the leading edge of the horizontal and the turtle deck stringers. So once it's center and square, you're happy with its location, clamp it in place so we can start with the vertical stabilizer next. I almost forgot one more thing. The horizontal stabilizer needs to be parallel to the top longerons on the fuselage. So if you have your fuselage nice and level and you have the horizontal stabilizer on the fuselage and it's square, you have to measure it with the level as well and make sure that it is level to the fuselage. Now you'll recall that the three different beams that make up the horizontal stabilizer, the leading edge, the center main beam, and the trailing edge, those are all different sizes. Now when I had built my fuselage, I had incorporated some plywood to make up those differences and keep the horizontal parallel. So you may have to do that now. You may have to make some shims and shim underneath the horizontal stabilizer where needed, but make sure you get it parallel to the fuselage longerons. Moving on to the vertical stabilizer, the first thing we need to do is to attach the 4 L brackets along the bottom. Now what I had done was I stood the vertical stabilizer upright on one of my flat countertops, and then I slid the L brackets up to it, marked the hole locations, and then drilled the vertical stabilizer on my drill press. Once I had the brackets attached to it, I took it over to the airplane and stood it up on top of the horizontal stabilizer. Now the boards that make up the horizontal stabilizer, those are different sizes. So there's going to be some shimming required underneath the L brackets of the vertical to get it to sit properly. Once you have it shimmed and you have it centered down the fuselage, again you can use those pencil mark references on the horizontal to do that. You can go ahead and mark through the L brackets onto the horizontal stabilizer and drill those holes. Now if you've had my fuselage video, you already know that I had added a couple, or at least one extra piece of spruce on the fuselage for the forwardmost L brackets on the vertical stabilizer. So those attaching bolts go through the forward L bracket on the vertical, through the horizontal, through the added piece of spruce on the fuselage as well. So if you have that arrangement, you go ahead and drill through the horizontal and down through those fuselage attach points as well. So to recap here quickly, we have the horizontal stabilizer attached to the fuselage. It is centered on the fuselage and it is square to the fuselage. We have the vertical stabilizer with its L brackets attached. We have it bolted to the horizontal stabilizer and where required bolted through into the fuselage as well. We have the vertical stabilizer in alignment with the tail post, and we have it down the center line of the fuselage. So everything should be mounted as you see in this picture, and we've taken precautions so that the rudder will not bind, and we have things shimmed where necessary to keep them square and parallel. Now at this point, especially with the horizontal stabilizer, it's going to sag and droop a little bit under its own weight. It's not going to be perfectly parallel to the floor or anything else. It's going to droop a little bit, and the tips of the horizontal stabilizer are not going to be square to the top of the rudder. All of that gets pulled into alignment with the cables, which we will get into shortly. But for now, you just want to make sure that things are centered, things are square to the fuselage, and that trailing edge on the vertical is in line with the tail post, because the rudder has to get a hinge to both of those components, and you want that to be correct so that the rudder won't bind. Alright, let's move on. As some of you already know, I will be using my custom method of installing hinges. I'm not going to go into that right here in this DVD, because that was covered in the tail hint DVD, but I thought this was an interesting picture because it shows how the horizontal tends to sag and droop under its own weight without any kind of cable support. But don't panic, we'll get to cables here shortly and get that taken care of as well. Here I'm fitting my elevator to the horizontal stabilizer using my internal piano hinge that's been talked about a little bit in some of the other hint videos. What I'm doing here is I'm attaching the hinge to the elevator. Now what I had done, this is going to be blurry I'm sure, I had taken half of the hinge and epoxied it into the horizontal stabilizer yesterday. And again, those slits in the wood are 1/8 inch wide. So with the extruded aluminum hinge, not the hinge with the loops, so to speak. These are I can't think of the part number, but these are extruded aluminum, so they're not the bent hoops. They're actually molded hoops, so to speak. Anyway, with that half and a one of the thick, the wide, long popsicle sticks for crafts, with one of those cut to size, and along with the hinge, that makes up that 1/8 inch gap in here, or the 1/8 inch wide slit that I had milled into these pieces. Now you're not going to be able to see it, but what I had done was I epoxied the popsicle stick, both sides, top and bottom of the stick, slid it into the slit, and then I epoxied both sides, the top and bottom of the hinge half, and slid it underneath the popsicle stick. Now it doesn't matter if the popsicle stick goes on top or on the bottom, but when you look at the hinge, on end like this, it will come across flat, and then the loop kind of goes up above, and I had put the popsicle sticks on top of that where the loop curls around, so to speak. That's how I did it. And you do the same thing on both pieces. So if you put the popsicle stick on top of this side, you have to put it on top on this side. That will keep this part and this part on the same plane. It's still going to be hard to tell, but this edge here is on the same plane as this edge. So I had done that last night. I put the hinges, I epoxied the hinges into the horizontal yesterday, and what I had just done today is I took the other half of the mating hinge with the popsicle sticks, epoxied them into the slits, and then I took this fancy support apparatus that I spent all day making, which is just a cardboard box and a plastic crate, but those with a couple pieces of wood hold the elevator in place, and I got my hinge pins in, and I've got everything aligned. These align. This is a nice slit, maintained spacing all the way down. There's the middle hinge, and then down there is the end hinge. So that's how I had done it. Once I had done the hinge halves on this side, I let them dry overnight, and I came back, fitted them into this side, slid in the hinge pins, and then I basically just started to squeeze this together to bring this in as far as I needed it to be. And then I would take the whole elevator and I'd work it up and down its full range of motion, up and down, and that would allow the newly input hinges to move around and wiggle and kind of find their own set in relation to the hinge halves that are affixed now because they're nice and dry and cured. So that's how I had done it. So when you have it in place and the epoxy's quite not set, you go ahead and with your fancy support apparatus out of the way, you move the elevator through its full range of travel up and down, and that will kind of establish the gap, and it will allow each individual hinge to move around and find its own alignment. And let me see, I have one here, hold on. I have a small screwdriver here, and what I'll do is I'll come out here now every so often and just make sure that these hinge pins, I can't see what I'm doing, just make sure that these hinge pins still slide back and forth easily. That way I know there's no epoxy getting in there, and the alignment is close enough that the one hinge half is not binding with the other hinge half. And I don't know if you can really do any better than that. So there it is. That's the long-winded version of how I did it. And I still haven't made my second elevator yet. When I get the other one made, I'll do the other side. But so far, so good.
Earlier I could not remember the hinge material that I'm using on this airplane, so here it is. This is the extruded aluminum hinge. This is a structural hinge. It's not like the rolled loop hinges, which are not really considered a structural item, but for control surfaces and on the ailerons and stuff, you know, this is the hinge to use. So I buy it in the 6-foot lengths, and then I go ahead and cut it to whatever size, shape, length that I want it to be, and then I go ahead and I stick it down into the slots that I had milled out in the wood using my milling machine. And then this picture here is just actually the next couple pictures are just a couple pictures of the hinge in place, and you can kind of tell how the flat part of the hinge is on the bottom, and then the extruded loops, they kind of sit on top of the hinge, so to speak, and then the popsicle slides in on top of the hinge, and then the whole assembly gets epoxied in place. So it's really nothing new. I think I've covered this before in another video. I know I talk about it a lot because it pops up in just about every one of them so far. So no big deal. Like I said, it's my own thing. I'm sure most of you probably choose not to do this, but if you do, here's some good information for you, hopefully. And again, as I've talked about in some of the other videos, once the hinges are epoxied in place and they're dry, you drill through the whole assembly and run your screws in. I use these T-nuts and just embed them right into the soft spruce. Since the hinge and the popsicle stick internally are lathered with epoxy, I didn't see a need to use any kind of plywood. And then on the other side, these are just stainless recessed screws or countersunk screws that I use, and I countersink the wood, just run them in flush so that they won't stick out through the fabric. So these are permanent. If you have any serious hinge issues, pretty much the whole wood assembly that they're attached to will have to be rebuilt, because these are not going to come out.
And here are a few more pictures of the elevators being attached to the horizontal stabilizer. Obviously the vertical stabilizer has been removed, but the horizontal is still bolted to the fuselage to hold it in place. And my fancy contraption there is underneath the elevator, holding it level with the horizontal while the epoxy on the hinges sets up. Here's another view of the same thing. I know it's incredibly exciting, and there's really nothing else going on in this picture that's important. And then this final picture is just yet another shot from a distance with a single elevator in place. At this point in time, I didn't have the other elevator even made yet, so this is the only elevator that I could take pictures of.
Hey everybody, just wanted to say real quick again, thanks for checking out my YouTube videos, and just a couple of real quick tidbits before you leave. If you'd be so kind as to check out my GoFundMe page, the link is down in the description of these videos. For those of you who find it in your heart to donate for this new cause of mine, I've got another project going on, and there's some really cool things I'd like to do with this aircraft, and again, that's all explained in my GoFundMe. But if you find moved enough to go do that and donate, I've got this horizontal stabilizer skin, and donors will get their name put on this skin, and ultimately when this gets filled and the aircraft gets finished, this is going to be hung up on the wall of honor in my hangar. Just a little bit of recognition for those donors who helped make the project a reality. Another thing too is, I'm sure you've noticed that even this video that I'm making right now is of the same or worse quality than the video that you just watched, and that's because, believe it or not, this camera is the exact same camera that I filmed the original hint videos with. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm not really sure why, but I know the video quality lacks, but hopefully the information within is worth something. And the other thing that I want to mention real quick is, again, these are little snippets from my hint video DVDs, so a lot of these individual clips just kind of come to an abrupt end. That's just the way it is when I'm trying to rip these DVDs apart and re-edit them into small little segments, and they just kind of end weird at times. But that's it. That's all I wanted to say. And again, thanks, and I hope you'll come back, check out my channel, and see if there are any new videos and updates. All right, I'll talk to you then. See you.